with slashes in them. Everybody serves in the military, and it's a macho thing to put your term code and your birth date in those. So whenever you see a full date, and let's say 182, whatever, that's always that.
So the birth date is 70, so they were here in about 1990.
Oh, I'm sorry, Deb.
Go ahead.
No, you know, they have a really wonderful network of donors, but they had any excavation.
Story time.
Greenwald was an amazing guy. He died recently, and he was just such a wondrous dig director. He was gentle, he was soft-spoken, he was patient, he was kind, he spoke Turkish beautifully. His father, Crawford Greenwald Sr., is a famous hummingbird photographer for the National Geographic back in the 50s and 60s. If you go back and find issues of the Geographic where they have these slow-mo shots of hummingbirds, the photographer is usually Crawford Greenwald, also a DuPont. And this is what you get to do when you have DuPont money. You get to spend your time with expensive camera equipment, taking pictures of little birds. Greenwald really was a cool guy, and every Wednesday he would go down into Izmir to take care of excavation business, make phone calls back to Berkeley and Harvard, do whatever. And then we get a buck. You go down to the main road, you take a public bus, you just flag a bus down, and it takes you right into Izmir to the bus garage. And then at the end of the day, you take the bus back and ask them to drop you off at the corner, and you walk up to the dig. So one year we're in there, and there were, at the time, there were 80 lira to a dollar. 80 old Turkish lira to a dollar. Greenwald is in the bus station before he's coming back to Sardis, and he wants to use the bathroom. And right now the charge is a lira for using bathrooms. Back then it was 2.5 lira, whatever. And so Greenwald goes in and he uses the bathroom, and he comes out, and the attendant says that'll be 2.5 lira, and Greenwald says, I don't have 2.5 lira, but here's a 5 lira note. There were 5 lira bills in that day. Well, there are now, so it's similar. The attendant says, I don't have any change. This is a problem. Greenwald says in his best Turkish, that's not a problem. Let the next man go in for free. The attendant says, I can't do that. That would not be right. Greenwald says, let the next guy come along and pay you 2.5 lira, and then you can take a 2.5 lira tip. The guy says, I can't do that. That wouldn't be right. Well, this is a bathroom in a bus station. This is not like serious negotiation. But all of a sudden it's turned into the Twilight Zone. And so Greenwald then says, I'll tell you what, I'll go use the bathroom a second time. That adds up to 5 lira. The guy says, that would fool no one. Like, what? So finally Greenwald does something that I never saw him do in his life. He picks up the 5 lira note, he rips it in half, and he gives the guy half of the note. He says, there's your 2.5 lira. And the guy at that point screams, police! Arrest this man for insulting the memory of Ataturk, because Ataturk's image is on every banknote. The police arrest Greenwald, and they take him down to the Izmir police station for hours. Before finally he points out that, you know, he's a very well-connected American. He runs this excavation. Listen to his Turkish. He really is a member of the Turkish-American community. This is a bad idea to keep him here. And finally they let him go. Don't screw with the image of Ataturk, man. Just do not go there. That would fool no one. Such a brilliant line. Greenwald used to bring us out here he'd bring bottles of cognac every summer, and we'd come out here and we would listen to Shakespeare plays on a stereo and sip cognac under the stars in the temple. It was just idyllic. It was just amazing.
Have you heard of Longwood Gardens?
And he's not yawning because you are around him. He's actually very happy that you are with him. That window there never had glass. This thing had a conch that went up, and this was like the area which created a coolness in the center. That was the idea in the Syrian times, but this became so popular, they repeated it here too. So this was like the actual thing that closed that window off, and still light came in. And in some of them, with these conchs, it was very common to put a cross in the upper part, so that the light going through the cross will cast its shape, image onto the altar. There are many examples of it. So thus that window will not be closed, so that this light will fall upon, and it will be seen as a miraculous epiphany of the cross on the altar. Very common.
Asian shore, where the land is very low lying and it's kind of swampy and malarial, and there was a colony over there. And it was a colony called, the colony was called Chalcedon, or Chalcedon. And one of Bizus' guys turned to him and said, "Those freaking morons, they must be blind." And Bizus said, "Oh my God, we've arrived, because this is where we want to be." And it's the perfect spot for a place. You're right on the Bosporus, leading up into the Black Sea. He didn't know that quite yet. But it's easily defensible from land. It's protected on two sides of the triangle by water. This is perfect, man. It has nice hills, so you can look out and see who's coming from through Rome. Greek times, Alexander later. It was a place on the map and a very prosperous community indeed, port community. So. That's why this place is ideal, and everybody thereafter recognizes just the perfect. There are all these minarets that are made of different substances and different proportions. And what about these buttresses here on this side of the building? When we walk over there, what about the trench that goes down to marble platforms and foundation work that's even lower? And then when we get inside, we're going to go through these stairways to get up to the second floor galleries. And just the stairways themselves feel like Byzantine. They're just these narrow corridors pushed back and forth. So a lot of stuff that whispers here. Byzantine is not an adjective describing complicated intrigue for no reason. And then up on the second floor galleries, there are all these layers of burials, bits of mosaic. The dome collapsed, the structure stands, they have to rebuild the dome. And the dome collapses because the building, the shallow dome is exerting tremendous, I'm not an engineer, forgive me if I'm butchering the concepts, but the dome is exerting tremendous lateral pressure on the other structural elements, and they weaken, they destabilize, and the dome collapses. When we go up to the second floor galleries, we'll go to a couple of places where you can see columns, which are dramatically off of perpendicular. They're being pushed out towards the exterior walls. And one sometimes wonders if all of a sudden one day the columns might all just go bang, 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 bang up into.
make your petition or you make your case, and then Sultan doesn't give you, okay, this is the decision. We'll take care of it. The scribes take his notes, and then they say, we will take care of it, and we will let you know. So it goes. That's it. No sitting, no chat, nothing. As short as possible, as respectful as. So you come straight, you go backward, boom. That's the protocol of this. Otherwise, you won't be able to walk around that area, so it's forbidden. That's it. The rest of this palace belongs to royal family of the Sultan. Okay. So now, from now on, we will be in the harem section or forbidden area.
The one other thing about this courtyard in particular is that there would be great ceremonies here for big ambassadors when they came, and one of the things that travelers remark on when they write back to their home countries about visiting the Sultan or being part of an embassy that came and the ambassador got in, but they had to stay outside. But they talk about how this courtyard could be lined with janissaries in the costumes like those two guys who are out there just now, and they remark on how the janissaries would stand in total obedience, total silence, and you would come in here, and this is a big space, lined with janissaries, not
Up to 3,000 people.
So they, and that was part of the show, and it's part of the Sultan's message to anybody coming to be received. Like, this is the discipline I have in my people, and this is the respect I get from my people. I expect the same from you. There are all sorts of really clear messages being sent all the time here.
Made of gardens. In this area, we have got closed spaces like halls used by the family members or Sultan for different purposes. But at the present day, they are exhibition halls. That's why I wanted to come here, and when nobody is here, I want you to see those exhibitions on your own without crowd. And today it won't be crowded, but at least nobody's here, so you can visit on your own. And I will give you the free time, so you can visit as much as you want. The first hall, that gate you see there, those are the ceremonial costumes of the Sultans in chronological order. So you will enter, turn right, earliest example, and you will make a circle, and you will come through the same gate. It's not a big. It's golden horn, very close bridges, okay? So if you see the bridges next to each other, that's golden horn. It's narrow, okay? So that's dead end. It goes,
You could be in it.
finishes there, gets
Come on,
shallow,
Megan.
and at the end we've got a little creek, okay? Little creek. And that's it. That was the protected harbor of
Miss
Istanbul
Megan.
or Constantinople. And the chain that you saw yesterday was closing the mouth somewhere from Istanbul all the way to the beginning of Galata Bridge. So that's the way that they close. When the Ottoman Sultans conquered the city, they found Byzantine palaces in such ruins that they couldn't inhabit. This palace was abandoned in 1860, so the Ottoman Sultans lived here from 1550s all the way to 1860, so 300 years. 1860, they built the European-style palace along the Bosphorus that we have seen on Bosphorus cruise this afternoon. That's the last residence of the palace. So that's why you don't see the original furniture in those exhibition halls. They moved away from the palace. And they used Stockholm Palace for their archives for 70 years. And in 1923, when we declared the new republic, so we have. In 1890, when the Ottoman Sultan built the first bridge, Galata Bridge, at the mouth of Golden Horn, it was a tall bridge. to be able to walk or to be able to drive on it, you had to pay a fee. So because of that fee, those boatmen could work a couple decades. Because people were still coming and paying the boatman was working. But if then they were in rush, they had to go faster, instead of waiting for the boatman and rolling by themselves, they walked. Gradually and gradually, the existence of the very first bridge killed that business. That business disappeared. I mean, it's like the business disappearing for maintenance of the typing. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it was a profession. Now the computers came, that profession died out. The boatman died out because of the bridge. Now, to get permission to visit something, that visiting the museum.
Which building is
Haydarpaşa Station is no. From there, you see there are two towers
to the
by
right,
the water.
yeah,
Yes.
okay.
And last year or the year before, they were maintaining the roof of this historical train station, and the guy burned the entire roof. He was maintaining the roof.
Important in terms of the ancient world on so many levels. The city itself was occupied from 3000 down through the Bronze Age and down through classical and Hellenistic periods and through Roman times. The story of its attack and defeat by the Greeks became this kind of model, it was a wonderful model of kind of literary storytelling and tragic events surrounding the city of Priam, and it was. I talked about it as this representation in Greek literature of this last great heroic effort by the Greeks before the decline of the Dark Ages set in. And the Greeks too saw it as this high point that they kept as a touchstone for their culture through the next millennium. And if you look at Greek art from 700 BC down to 300 BC and beyond, if you look at Greek literature, if you look at Greek philosophy, the stories of the Greeks at Troy just come up again and again and again and again. Vase painting after vase painting after vase painting of moments in the war. Achilles and Odysseus playing checkers with each other, or the death of Sarpedon on the battlefield, or Ajax committing suicide by his tent. These are just the icons that everybody was familiar with, and everybody growing up knew this material inside out. The world of Greek tragedy is built out of the mythology of Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey and the other returns and the other incidents in the war. What some people don't notice so much is that Plato and Aristotle are always talking about Homer, and everybody recognizes it when they're talking about Homer. If you read Plato in Greek and you've got the right text of Plato, you'll be reading along in this Greek text, and all of a sudden you'll notice that the spacing of the words is different on the page in the modern manuscript. And people just think it might be a misprint or something. No, that's a very careful editor of the text who is marking the direct quotes from Homer. Because Plato is just quoting Homer right and left. And he's assuming that the people reading his philosophical discourse are going to recognize that this is a reference back to Book 16, line 341 of the Iliad. And that just kind of washes over 99.999% of the readers. So this is just one of the built-in cultural DNA elements in the Greek world. How many of you have seen the movie Troy? Whoa. Can we rent a DVD and show it on a long drive? It's just looking at how the modern world deals with the images of the past is really interesting, and Troy is a great example of it. Troy, the movie, it's a bad movie. And one of the things that the directors make clear throughout the movie Troy is that they don't really care what Homer said about something, and they don't really care what the art styles were like. They just kind of make a big mishmash of things. But that's kind of cool. And that's the way mythology worked in the ancient world. There was not any fixed story that couldn't be adapted, that couldn't be changed. Just because one writer says that Agamemnon survived Troy and got home and was murdered in a bathtub doesn't mean that the next guy who comes along follows the same line. He can change things up a lot. So in the movie Troy, Agamemnon's brother Menelaus is killed early in the battles at Troy, even though Homer says that Menelaus survived and went home and lived with his wife Helen, who ditched him 10 years earlier. That's kind of ugly. So the variation in mythology is something that modern people don't have an easy time accepting. There was not one canonical story that everyone had to cleave to. Myth is really fluid and flexible. Salih.
What you must keep in mind is that tradition of times when most people find out about that in the small text. So to many people, these stories that they listened to was the core of their existence. This is what they belonged to. This is what made them a tribe. So accordingly, according to what the times were like, they could have changed. You see beautiful examples of this in the Crusades also. When the troubadours were telling the stories of the Crusaders, according to what the political essence was back in the time, according to whether they were making it or not, they added and subtracted so that people felt better about it. So it must have been similar to that too.
I just wanted to talk about a couple of other brief things that I think are important and may not come up as we go around. And they're part of the ancient idea of what Troy means. The first is Homer himself. How many of you have read even snippets of the Odyssey or the Iliad? Most of you, or a good number of you anyway. Homer is this label that we slap onto the poetry with the titles the Iliad and the Odyssey. But Homer... And the Greeks say that Homer was a guy who came from a specific moment in a specific place. The problem is that they say that many different places and many different moments claim to have been the birthplace and residence of Homer. Chios, the island off the Turkish coast, says Homer is ours. Lesbos says Homer is ours. Smyrna says Homer is ours. And Homer keeps getting associated with different places around the Aegean. The poem seems to have, the poem goes back to the Bronze Ages. There's no question about that. It has detail in it that existed in 1100 BC or 1200 BC and does not exist later. And so this is a poetic tradition that knows about stuff that was going on in the Bronze Age that we have archaeologically, certain kinds of helmets, certain kinds of equipment, certain strategies and techniques in battle. But the poem also has stuff that we know didn't exist in the Bronze Age, that only started getting used in the 8th and 7th centuries BC. And we can document that archaeologically. And what you actually have in Homer is a tradition of poetry that extended over hundreds of years. And it's a kind of bardic tradition where the stories were familiar and the stories were told and the stories were sung, and they were sung repeatedly, generation after generation after generation. And this is a style of poetry called oral poetry. And people started really figuring this out in the early 20th century when they started noticing really precise patterns in the words that Homer used and where those words showed up in a metric, measured line of poetry. And they started figuring out the oral techniques that Homer used so that a guy could sing hundreds and hundreds of lines of poetry without losing track of the story, without losing track of where he was in a metric line. And it's clearly an oral tradition. And there are modern societies that have similar oral traditions. In Yugoslavia, in the former Yugoslav Republic, in West Africa, there are oral traditions among West African states. Georgia, and yeah, there's this kind of poetic construction happens around the world. So Homer is the label that gets slapped on that whole tradition of oral poetry. But the text is set down by about 500 BC, and there was a canonical text that then got disseminated and was used in poetic competitions in Athens and elsewhere, where poets would compete and they would be measured against the text, not to make sure they got every word right, but just to make sure that they were following the sequence of the story as people were comfortable with it. That's pretty much where Homer is in the Greek world. The poems are a towering presence. The idea of the poet as a towering figure is really important. The other little thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of the Trojan War and in terms of Troy is seen as the birthplace of the Romans. And the Romans carry on the tradition of Troy as much as the Greeks do, and it's really important for the sensibility of the Romans. The tradition, which goes back very early, says that one of the Trojans fled from the burning city and the toppling city, a guy named Aeneas. And Aeneas was a nephew of the king Priam, and he was fated to flee from Troy along with his son Iulus and his father Anchises, and they were fated to migrate across the Mediterranean to the west and to eventually land on the Italian peninsula and start the line of people that would become the Romans. Aeneas' son is named Ascanius originally, but he's also called Iulus, and in Iulus, the name I-U-L-U-S, you see the root of the family name of the Caesars, Julius, which was a family line in Rome. And the Julian line traced their ancestry back to Aeneas, and they made a big deal out of it. And so when Julius Caesar takes control of the state in, 56 BC for starters, he is bringing his family's line to a new height of political power, and he makes a big deal out of the fact that his line goes back to Iulus and Aeneas, and Aeneas was the son of the goddess Venus. So the family has divine origin. That's pretty cool. I'd like my ancestor to be a god. Yeah.
He comes to visit us, Julius Caesar.
Yeah, I was gonna. Yeah. When Caesar defeats Pompey in Alexandria in 48 BC, he takes a trip after that over to Troy, and he visits the birthplace of his line. And Lucan, the Roman poet, a Roman poet under the Emperor Nero, Lucan describes Caesar's trip to Troy, and Caesar's stumbling around, and the site was overgrown. It was as opaque to Caesar as it is to us in terms of just the tumble of walls. But Lucan tells a story about how Caesar's stumbling around the site, and this guard comes out from a shack and says, "Hey, you're trampling all over the Temple of Athena, you moron!" And Caesar says, "Oh, sorry, didn't realize that was architecturally important there." So we've got the same tension between tourist and impenetrable archaeology that we're going to get here today. Caesar wanted to move the capital of the Roman Empire. There was a rumor that Caesar wanted to move the capital of Rome from the Italian peninsula over to the site of Troy. And that was gossip that was especially fomented after Caesar's assassination, as if, this is one of the other reasons it was good to kill him, because, he wanted to move Rome away from Rome and take it back to Troy. Hey, beat it. You're stealing my thunder. Rome, even in the time of Caesar, recognizes how important the Troad Peninsula is and how the viability of the Eastern Mediterranean is as an attractive place. Because I can imagine that Caesar wanted to move things back here. There's strong arguments even in the 1st century BC for that. What we have here is a Greek.
Tell me more, Mr. Don.
Greek colony from the island of Lesbos, just out of sight in the mist, and it was founded by the Aetolian Greeks, who were a branch of Greek blood, almost as important as the Dorians and Ionians. And one of the things they did when they first came to this island was they dedicated a big temple up here at the highest point of the Acropolis. That just means high city. And what you've got here is a really nice mock-up of what we can reconstruct about the temple there. Some of the columns have been re-erected and put back into place, but clearly the temple would have been the dominant piece of architecture for the whole city. It's a Doric style temple, which means it's got these flat backgammon chip pillow shaped discs as the top bit of capital underneath a square rectangular piece of stone, and then you've got fluted columns that are made in segments running down to the stylobate, the base of the temple, without any kind of extra base on the bottom. The columns run directly into the floor of the temple. One of the interesting things I think about this is the temple that has on at least one end, they've got a frieze, a bit of sculptural frieze, which is more a feature of Ionian temples. And so what you're seeing in this temple is actually architecturally important in terms of the mixture of Ionian elements with Doric elements. But one of the things I'd like to say about temple architecture is that all of the temple architecture we have from the ancient world is articulation of stuff that originally was made in wood. These buildings go back to wooden earlier models, and they're building in stone because they've been over to Egypt and they've seen Egyptian temples with great forests of columns made out of granite, and they're coming back here and saying, you know, if our city is going to lay any claim to sophistication, we need one of those big hulking stone temples. So they start building these things. The columns of a temple originally would have been tree trunks that would have been fluted, shaved down, so you have these like curved flutes, so to help with the drainage of water off of the flutes. The reason you'd have a round capital covered by a square capital is because you want to have two wooden pieces with grain running in cross directions to prevent the splitting of the tree trunks as long as possible. If you run the two column capital elements at cross grains, they're less likely to split as quickly. If you look at this decoration at the ends of the temples where you have these three-pronged things coming down, those are known as the triglyphs, and those represent the cross beams that would have been built in a wooden temple. And so they're remembering the elements of the wooden temples, and they want to build the detail in that they're always used to. All of the stuff on the roofs, the palmettos along the tile roofing would have been designed to keep birds from going in and nesting inside the tiles, which would have cracked the tiles early on. And they make them decorative and nice, but they go back to really simple structural elements. And the other thing about temples is not many people went into these temples. The temples housed an image of the god, the temples housed the equipment appropriate to the worship of the god, and the priests got into the temples proper, but you didn't get in. If you were coming off the street and you were worried about things and you wanted to go pray to Athena, well, you could come to the precinct and you could be on the edges of stuff, but you would stay outside. You can relay concerns, you can make prayer deposits, you can make votive offerings. And the votive offerings would be just like the stuff that you see in churches in the modern day, whether it's in the Latin American world where they have little milagros that are like hammered tin pieces of body, like body parts, arms, legs, teeth, ears, eyes, and you're praying to God to restore your health in a certain part of your body, or offerings that you make where you're making a prayer for somebody's salvation. That kind of stuff would be a standard offering at one of these temples as well. And the people really used this as a place where they could try to relay their concerns to the divinities. Occasionally during the course of the year, the images of the gods in these temples would be paraded out, and there would be ceremonies where the public could come closer up here and images of the gods and other tokens of the gods would be paraded through the city. So you would have some connection between the people and the stuff inside the temple. It's not sealed off all year round forever, but there is this kind of interaction that keeps people happy. The priests of the temple and the the deity of the temple would also own a lot of land. And the land might be right nearby, or the land might be down along the valley, but there would be income generated from the olive trees, income generated from the citrus trees, from the wheat that was sold. And the income would go to the upkeep of the temple and towards the creating of festivals and the funding of feasts on festival days. So this kind of religious stuff was built into the fabric of a community in the same way that a mosque will have soup kitchens and schools and communal interaction and intervention. The temples had that same kind of communal function, and they fit into the fabric of the community much more than people sometimes think about. And it's good to recognize them. This really is one of those wondrous examples of early Doric architecture, or early classical Doric architecture. Okay.
When the Arabs started raiding the area. Now, one thing that one must realize is, I mentioned this earlier today, it's easier to paint these things black and white. Most of the sailors that took the Arabs up and down were fake Christians, and they were very happy with it. Because otherwise it would have been such a loss of time if the Arabs didn't. Two and one.
Where are we right now, Professor McGuire?
Well, UB student, that's a great question to ask, because we are in Pergamon and we are at the temple of the Roman Emperor Trajan. And Trajan was one of the greatest of the Roman emperors. He ruled from 98 to 117, as all UB students recall. And he was the first emperor in a long time to send a lot of money over into this region of the Mediterranean. And so they wanted to offer him thanks. They built a temple to him on this site. But it was a temple that was built with his approval and with his countenance. And the interesting thing about these temples is you wonder about temples being houses to the gods. Temples are supposed to be houses to divinities, and here we have a temple to a mortal, to the emperor of the Roman world. And the way that goes back a long way. Alexander alienated some of his people by asking to be worshipped as a god, but that was an expectation in the Persian world, in the Indian world. There's a pressure on the Roman emperors in the East to get worshipped as gods. And so they allow themselves to be worshipped in connection with the goddess Roma. So this really is a temple to the goddess Roma and to the emperor's cult. And those two things go hand in hand. Trajan was a great engineer. Trajan was a great builder, and he was a very stable force in the Roman emperor for 20-some years. He was succeeded by his adopted son, Hadrian, who ruled from 117 to 138. And Trajan and Hadrian and Antoninus Pius and then Marcus Aurelius together are four emperors that rule across a century and really deliver a century's worth of prosperity and stability to the whole Mediterranean. Does that answer your question, Jimmy?
That more than answered my question. Wow.
Köpek uçmak istemiş, bir gün karlar yağar.
Hadi devam.
Bravo! Yay!
Bu kadar mı bile çok sevdiler. Devam.
Karga ona anlatmış bizimki bize inanmış, tırmanmış koşa koşa balkonun kenarına, açmış ayaklarını, dikmiş kulaklarını, havlayıp birkaç kere atmış kendini yere. Köpek ölmüş vah vah vah, karga gülmüş ha ha ha.
Bravo çocuklar, çok bravo.
Bravo! Yay!